the outward trappings of wealth were signals of success. So I had the BMW, I had a flash apartment, but one by one I had to let them go, because when the Asian currency crisis hit that area, even the Sultan of Brunei pulled back. Up to that point, we'd been pretty fearless because everything we did turned to gold, and then all of a sudden it didn't.
Martin Mileham, thank you so much for joining Joe and I today.
Thanks, Anne. Thanks for asking me.
Joe and I always start with a question around what has been either a challenge or an event in your life that has had a significant impact, and why?
Back in the olden days when you used to go to ATMs to get cash out, was a wake-up call. I wanted a ham sandwich and it said insufficient funds. I think I had $2.40 in the bank. And this was after a long period of working overseas, and it brought it home to me that I had to do something because what I was doing wasn't working. So really what that predicated was a move that started with Melbourne and ended in Dubai, ultimately back here in Perth, because I'm from Perth. So it was a catapult, if you like, to send me into a place that I never dreamed I would end up, really, to be honest. I had spent some time in the Middle East before, but that trigger, which made me realise I needed a job, at that time we'd had our own business, and there'd been a currency crisis in Asia, which sent us to the wall, basically, because all of our work was in Asia. I spent 12 months working in Melbourne, and in that time made contact with a few folks that said there's a lot of work in Ireland at the moment, in Dublin. So I thought, I'll go to Dublin, but I'll go via Dubai. And I never got to Dublin because I got a job in Dubai, and the rest is history, as they say. I spent 10, 11 years there and met Rachel, my wife, there, and the rest is history.
Tell us about that ham sandwich that you were wanting to have on that day. What was the moment that you just said, this is impactful?
It's a complex story. I'll make it as simple as possible. The company that we had was consulting up into Asia, and we bought a building in North Perth to set our office up. As I say, the currency crisis hit and we had all sorts of trouble, and the work dried up. I was operating and living out of that building, which was half complete. I didn't have a kitchen, so the only way I could eat was really, go and buy sandwiches and things. That hit me like, well, I don't actually have enough money to live here, so I better do something. And luckily, I guess for me, I had a very lucky upbringing. Was only child. My mum and dad looked after me. I went through uni pretty much on their dime, although I did a bit of work here and there. But I'd never really experienced that isolation of being on your own, no money, no prospect of money, and what are you going to do? There's nothing you can do in society except go look for the unemployment benefits. I tried that. They told me sorry, because I'd been self-employed. The amount of data that they needed and forms filled in was not funny, and I wasn't comfortable with that. So in the end, I actually told my parents, who graciously loaned me some money, which enabled me to get out of Perth. And that job came up in Melbourne through a partner in a firm. I think you probably know the work they did is Federation Square. So I came in and helped with that and other projects, and spent a year there. It was quite scary because a complete uprooting. I'd been a Perth guy, spent a bit of time overseas, a few months here and there, probably no more than a year and a bit working overseas. But this meant that I had to really pretty much say, well, let's see what happens here, and roll the dice, and went to Melbourne. And as I said, I explained the trajectory from there. I think the thing that drove me was a bit of pride as much as fear. Certainly I didn't want to be one of those folks that relied on unemployment benefits. It just wasn't me. And the fact that they made it hard for me to get it proved it. As I said, went over to Melbourne, spent a year working there. Very interesting time. It opened the world up. The Dubai thing was the best thing that had happened in terms of my career, and certainly in personal life. It led me to believe that, well, you can throw caution to the wind and let it carry you.
Martin, that challenge of all of a sudden recognising that you didn't have the financial resources to do what you needed to do in Perth, how has that experience held you in good stead for other future scenarios in your life since then?
I'd held back a bit until then. It had been a series of things, almost chance. For example, we'd spent the previous 6, 7 years working for the Sultan of Brunei, and that had exposed us to a whole different cultural experience. And I was very nervous going into that. But as time went by, it was clear that I could do things that they couldn't get from other people. And then with this move to Melbourne and then ultimately the move to Dubai, it gave me confidence. I guess I've probably overstepped the mark a few times, overestimated my competence. You soon find out if you're in a minefield and you can back off a bit. But the lesson was, if it's on offer, I'll have a go.
Mm.
And if I think I can do it, I'll give it a go. Now, if it fails, well, why? And there's no written trajectory that you follow. There's no rule book. As they say, every plan fails when it's presented with reality, because you have to change it.
And the message around failure. So you've come to this wise perspective, but back when you were looking at your bank account and there was not enough money there, did fear of failure play into what was happening for you at that time?
At that time, because as I said, I spent the previous 7 years plus working predominantly for the Sultan of Brunei. I was a very wealthy person at the time, and everything they did was lots of money. And so I'd come to the point where, well, the outward trappings of wealth were signals of success. So I had the BMW, I had the flash apartment, I had all that. But one by one, I had to let them go, because when the Asian currency crisis hit that area in, what was it, late 90s, even the Sultan of Brunei pulled back. And so all our jobs dried up. Up to that point, it'd been pretty fearless because everything we did turned to gold. And then all of a sudden it didn't. It took probably 6 months or more to realise that, well, that was an aberration. Life isn't like this. You were lucky and you had 7 good years, but this whole trappings of wealth, it costs money. If you want to live that lifestyle, you better damn well have the backup. What choices did you have? You've got to let it go and start again. That's pretty scary. But what I found was those things you thought were indispensable, when they're gone, you didn't care.
What were those points that you realised that you didn't care about them?
For example, the BMW that I paid a lot of money for, all of a sudden it was an anchor, something growing back. So I loved the car, but I thought, well, it's got to go. It went. I had another car, so I had a cheaper one. I'd go around in that. And with the building that we'd bought, trying to hang on to that. But at the time, the mortgage was huge, so better let that go too. That was an aspiration we'd had, to set up our own thing in our own building. It wasn't going to happen, so we had to let that go. And there was a lot of pride had to be let go with those as well. So in the end, I ended up with, as I say, $2.50 or something in the bank account, unable to buy a ham sandwich, because here I was. It's all very well to have pride in that situation, but it's not going to buy you a ham sandwich. So you have to bury some of that and work out what you're going to do next.
Tell me about the pride piece. That's really hard for all of us. I mean, how did that make you feel about you in that moment and at that time where you needed to let go of everything that you worked really hard to get?
It was difficult, but at the same time, I wasn't terrified of it.
Mm-hmm.
I was fearful of it, but not terrified. In my earlier times, I'd done a little bit of travelling, and so I wasn't someone that stayed in Perth all my life. So I knew that being a biggish fish in a small pond was not the be-all and end-all, and therefore what I valued at that time, well, I could rewrite that value system pretty easily. Although, as I said, I'd been brought up with a material equals success type equation in my head. That's what our society tells us a lot of. And to that point, back in the 90s, there weren't too many people telling you that wasn't the case. I mean, I spent a good part of 1 year in the 80s in London, where at the time greed is good. Everybody getting around in their Porsches, and I lived in W1 just up from Chelsea, and I saw that as the badge of success. You had to reassess all of that when you're back to zero.
When you've sold everything up, you've had that recognition. What were the most important things to you then?
Well, I think survival to some extent, and getting myself back a platform to spring from. Some folks have said to me, why are you always looking for the next thing? But that's been me to some extent. I've never really stuck in a job. The longest I've stuck in a job is probably six and a half years, which was when I was an associate director at one of the architectural firms in Perth. And that was a job I enjoyed, but it's what I graduated into. And then I learnt the trade. And from that point, 5 years is the limit. What
you're saying is that you came back to yourself and recognised that the skill sets that you had were really the important thing, not what the skill sets brought you.
I think my dad used to say, he spent 35 years in the bank. He said he was a slave to security. I can understand that, because there's a lot to be said for security, but that meant he didn't go to Sydney when he was offered a promotion. He stuck to the path because he wanted security for his family. And I can understand that, but it's not me. I've never been like that, and I've paid the price along the way. But I am fearful of not having security. I don't like it. So I use that time to rebuild the platform and get some security back to spring from.
So there was that fear of failure piece in there, but then there was also not secure. So both of those playing within that moment.
Well, it taught me the biggest lesson that later on, financially, in my opinion, led to a successful period, which was when things got tight in the late 90s with the business. My job was to do all the cash flow, and I'd have spreadsheets, and I'd look at these spreadsheets and, oh, well, we'll get this and we'll get that. Well, what it taught me was just because you put it in an Excel doesn't mean to say it's going to materialise. You could make any business look viable if you made up numbers. So that taught me a very valuable lesson about realism. Later on, when I went to Dubai and I ran a company there for several years, we had the best years ever. They used to say to me from the head office in Toronto, what's the profit this year? And I said, what's in the bank? Whereas a lot of the other branches were reporting profits, which were spreadsheets. I was reporting cash profits, and that's what led to success later on, that I've been held a view of success is you don't have to have a Ferrari. What you have to have is something viable. If you're enjoying your life and you're doing a job you like and you're not lying to yourself, I think that's probably fundamental. For me anyway, has been.
Interesting way of looking at it, Martin, is in context to how we report, how the market sees the value of something. It's all about the profit line that you're making.
I've spent most of my time subsequent to being in the first few years of just learning the trade of architecture. That has been mostly the business of architecture. And they say, how do you set up an architect in a small business? Well, you give him a big one. That proved to be true because most people in my field can't run a business, and that's where I've had a lot of success latterly in being able to come in and run a business. I'm still consulting now to Dubai and Abu Dhabi because of that. So it's the lesson I learned about being broke was there's a reason for being broke. There's no point being just fearful of it. You have to do something about it.
Yeah.
You can be scared, and that probably motivates you. But you have to be realistic and to say, don't generate spreadsheets that have got nonsense on them. That's not going to dig you out of the hole either. So the esoteric fear drives you to a very, very pragmatic view of dollars and cents, because at the end of the day, unless you want to opt out, unless you want to go and live in, I don't know, Byron Bay or somewhere and live in a caravan, you've got to have significant funds to live okay in this day and age. So that's my baseline is I want enough to live well enough to not be frightened. And I guess that's where the fear comes back. Rachel, my wife, has said to me a couple of times, I've said, yeah, I don't want to do that. Why not? Well, because I've got experience of what that feels like when it goes wrong. And I think this is a risk of going wrong. So it's a conservatism that's come from it to some extent. Also a realism to recognise you're not going to be, well, time will tell what happens, and there's only a certain amount of control that you as an individual have over that, what will happen.
Well, that $2.44 in the bank that day was being a much bigger teacher than you probably ever thought it ever would be.
And it's seared in my memory. I actually remember where the ATM was. It was in Newcastle Street in North Perth, not far from the building we'd bought. I remember walking down the street thinking, oh, well, I must have a few dollars in the bank. And that's why it's come up today as a talking point, 30-something plus years later. It certainly was a turning point. It drove both fear and realisation at the same time.
Martin, was that a fear that you consciously had up until that point, or was it something that you hadn't actually consciously thought about?
It was semi-conscious, I'd call it. There was this underlying trepidation for several months as I knew the money was drawing down. I knew I wasn't doing enough to top it back up. One of my ways of avoiding thinking about it too much was playing Battleship on the laptop till 2 a.m, doing things that distracted me. So I'd get up in the morning knowing that's another $1,400 I need to pay this and that and the other. So I knew it was coming. I suppose I was kidding myself to think there was more than enough for a ham sandwich in the bank. But that realisation that this is a very firm and solid message. You don't argue with the ATM. It's telling you the facts. And everything else you're doing is maybe. So this is the reality. and you need to deal with it. Just getting into a corner and worrying about it is not going to get you anywhere. I was lucky. I had people to help me out. My parents hadn't been there. Who knows, mate? Who knows? Maybe I would have found another way. That's the thing I don't know. Nothing's written, as they say. So that's been my ethos all along now. Well, nothing is written, and if you take one step to the left, you can always take a couple to the right if you need to. I think some folks get on a trajectory and think they can't change it.
Yeah. So, Mark, tell me, let's move to Dubai. So you're in Melbourne for 12 months and working on projects like Federation Square. What was the prompter to go to Dubai? And you also mentioned that you spent a long time in Dubai, more so than anywhere else. So what was that all about and why?
Well, I'd spent nearly would have been about 10 months in Oman back in the 80s, which had been just one of those fluky assignments where I'd been working in London. And I ended up working in Muscat for about 10 months for a very influential individual over there, building a house for him, what we'd call a palace, they called a house. And I liked the cultural side of it, because Oman back in the 80s was very, very Omani. It's not your commercial Middle East that you might see in a tourism catalogue. What it did do is revive memories of something I'd also never forgotten, which was when I was about probably 6, sitting in my mum and dad's car at the drive-in while they were asleep because they were bored silly, watching Lawrence of Arabia. And I was absolutely rapt as a 6-year-old. I just loved this thing. And it's been something recurrent in my life since that point, that I've had this affinity, both the movie and the places. And so I thought, okay, I'm kind of liberated now. I'm here in Melbourne. I've got no home, really. I'm sharing with some mates. I have nothing other than that to hold me here. So where would I go? So I started asking people, what's going on in the world? And I looked around. It was like internet was probably not as easy to search as it is today. Back then, you had to ask probably more questions. And at the time, as I said, Ireland was booming, and Dublin was the place where a lot of folks were heading. What I'll do, because I met a guy that said to me, look, I'm working on a job at the moment in Dubai called Emirates Towers, and this is one of the first high-rise buildings in Dubai that Sheikh Mohammed did back in the late 90s. And he said, I'm working on that job at the moment. There might be a couple of jobs with this firm that's out there. Why don't you stop off there and talk to this guy? So I did. And they said, oh, yeah, maybe. And I thought, well, rather than keep going, I'll hang around. And as luck would have it, a job came up, got an interview, got the job. It was a bit less simple than that, a couple more flights here and there. But at the end, I ended up, I recall being hired to work on a project as a site inspector, which basically means standing in the heat, making sure that everything was done right. And they put me up at, as I recall, the Howard Johnson, which is what I call a 1.5-star hotel in Dubai. And then from that point forth, found my feet. And as luck would have it, I was there for 11 years. Year 1, I was hired as the lowest paid person in that firm. And when I left, I was the highest paid and ran the place. I guess that was a bit of luck.
Well, was it, or was it because of you just knew how to use your skills?
Well, it's a combination of luck, and I think a lot of luck. I mean, I say to people about anything, business in particular, some people agree, some don't. It's 85% good luck, right place, right time. What had happened there was I'd gone there just for a job and something to see, and I spent a few years doing that work, and I got a bit of a reputation, the firm's being okay at the job. And what happened was the people above me kept getting fired by the client because the client didn't like them. And I ended up running that project because the client said, I want this guy running it because he knows what he's talking about. The rest of them don't. So I ended up doing, and long story, I left. I went off to work for Nakhil, which was the Dubai government, working on the Palm Jumeirah, the first of those big islands. And then I got headhunted from that. And then the guy that was running the company that had hired me, in fact, the guy that interviewed me first, he was driving back one evening from the East Coast, Fujairah, back to Dubai after the weekend, and he looked down to change the station on his radio and looked up and hit a camel in his Land Cruiser. And that camel and the Land Cruiser collided at about 150 closing speed, and he thought he was okay until he hit the next camel, and that came through and broke his neck. Oh. He ended up in intensive care in Dubai. They had to be airlifted off the middle of the desert. to Dubai Hospital, where he was in traction for some time and then came out of it. And of course, the company was minus a vice president of operations. And the CEO of the company from Toronto kept flying in, trying to keep the place afloat, and he kept appointing people and it wouldn't work out. And I met him one day through happenstance and talked to him, and he said, "What are you doing right now?" Anyway, long story, he offered me the job to try it out as director. I came in. The previous year, they'd lost $500,000. My first year, they made $4 million, which I guess was lucky. But from that point forth, we just made money hand over fist. So I spent the last 4.5 years in Dubai. That was my job, vice president operations of that firm. We had jobs like the Burj Khalifa, the tallest building in the world. We did projects on the Palm Jumeirah. We did Atlantis Hotel, which is a 2,000 key hotel and water park. So we had lots of fun with projects. Then time to move on again, and Rachel and I came back here in the interim. In that time, of course, as I said, I met Rachel there in Dubai early 2000s, and we got married very soon after. Even meeting Rachel was luck, because there's a lot of folks in Dubai partying, and this Egyptian lady that I knew said, "Oh, I know somebody you'd like." And that was Rachel. Later on, she told me, "Oh, that you're the third couple I've matched that have got married." And so this is not planned. This is all happenstance. This is all luck. As I said, the first step in that was going, "Oh, I better do something here." Back, here we are 30 years later.
So what was the greatest learnings from that trip to Dubai over that 11 years for yourself and your own personal growth and development?
The best thing for me was having only a suitcase, because that gave me complete flexibility. I've come back here now to Perth, and I have coffee every couple of weeks with the guys that I went through uni with. One guy that I know who's a lawyer, has been in the same job for 42 years. He's very secure, but was that me? I don't know. The difference between these guys and me was I had no anchor, and that was brought on me by failure. Because if I'd been more successful, I already had a mortgage on a house, I had a mortgage on a building, I'd bought another house. If that had continued, I probably would have stayed here in Perth. As it happened, the failure, or should I say, is failure, I guess, the change in circumstances, and then the ultimate bankruptcy. When I landed in Dubai, I had a grand total of minus $20,000 overdraft. So the thing that was the biggest asset was I was mobile and able to go and do what I had to do. I wasn't locked into any system. If I'd been locked into a job, or if I'd been locked into unemployment, say, and just stuck here with all sorts of obligations, I might have never got out of it. Who knows?
Not being attached to anything at that time. It takes a lot of courage. Where did that come from, Martin? And how did you fight against the fear of what you just experienced of failing, and yet have the courage to go, okay, well, I can take a 20 grand overdraft, land in a country that I've got no clue really what I'm going to do, and actually sit comfortably in that space?
And I was driving across the Muscat Bridge on the creek, and there used to be a radio station. I think it was a bunch of British DJs, and they used to have a call-in session in the morning. And every morning, people would ring in and say, "What song do you want to hear?" And he'd say, "And what are you running from?" And that's what he'd ask everybody, because everybody in Dubai was running from something. And to some extent, when you landed there in the late 90s, it was very much a land of folks who were all disconnected. They'd all disconnected, all the expats had anyway. I mean, let's face it, there's a population there of only a few 100,000, of which only 10% were local. So 90% of the population of that town at that time were separated from their base, from their foundation. And a lot of the expats, that I call the British and the Australians and the Canadians, Americans, I'd say 99% of them were all, well, let's give this a go. Because it hasn't worked out, or I'm here for an adventure. I mean, the decision to go there was taken fairly lightly, but upon landing there, it didn't take you long to recognise that it's actually a land designed for folks like this. You couldn't even buy a house at that time. You could only rent. So they made it very clear to you that you weren't here forever. When you arrived and you got your visa and you got your degree accredited by the local authorities to work as an architect, they made it very clear you're here for one reason: to work. They don't want your opinion on politics. They don't want to know your opinion on anything, frankly. So that's liberating in a way. I don't need to have an opinion. I can keep that for my mates at the pub. During the day, you work, you do your job, you do a good job, you get paid. And that's the way it worked in Dubai for many, many years. The environment in which I landed was I had a bloke who became a very good buddy who was a Romanian electrical engineer. He'd been a merchant seaman. He defected from Ceausescu's Romania. Fantastic stories. We used to have, yarns into the night. Another guy who was a Serbian engineer who'd come by way of, Sarajevo. Another guy who was a Syrian engineer, Russian educated. Another guy from Goa, Indian guy, an architect. So these all became the people that we shared our lives with, and that gave you a great sense of community in that you're all on the same page in a way. Over time, you became more comfortable. I found a place to call a more solid home, got a rental, and as I say, met Rachel. We got married. We took an apartment in Jumeirah, which is a nice spot near the beach, and then life took a whole different turn. But it took probably a couple of years to go from being completely without linkage to anything to actually building a bit of a connection to the place. And I think to some extent the fact that everybody else was in a similar boat really helped.
Mm. The word liberating, there's been a bit of a pattern in what you're saying, Martin. Since you've had that time in Dubai and things have changed for you, do you still hold on to that desire for liberation and freedom? Is that still there for you?
Yeah, it is. I think that being realistic, when these things happened, I was in my 40s. And so physically, mentally, you're probably more attuned to being a bit more footloose. Now I'm 65 and I've got to be realistic. I can't probably I won't replicate that. It's a time that's been and gone. Even Dubai itself, I go back to Dubai and Abu Dhabi once a year just for a few weeks to do some work, and the place has changed beyond recognition. So it's realising that times have changed, times moved on. I like the fact that I've got a nice house here in Perth. There are times when I go, it'd be great to just, go and do something, but I don't feel that I need that as much as I did 25 years ago. And I call it luck. I think being a bit attuned to the Middle Eastern way of thinking, I'd call it more karmic. And they say it's all written. When I say they, some of the Muslim faith believe things are written and some don't, but it's the movie, the Lawrence of Arabia thing keeps coming back. There's a scene in it where Lawrence says to the guys, nothing is written, because he goes into the desert and rescues this guy that they all said was toast. You can't get him. It's too late. And he went back and got him, and then he came back and said, nothing is written. So I like that mentality, but I have to be realistic. There comes a time when footloose and fancy free, it's not possible. That's that spreadsheet thing again, isn't it? Because you can say, I could go and do this. Well, actually, you can't, because you're not 45. They're not going to hire a 65-year-old to come be a site inspector on a project in so-and-so, because it doesn't exist anymore. Where would I go? Albania? There's friends of mine that have travelled to Albania, or they've travelled to Turkmenistan, or they've gone. There's one chap I knew in Dubai. He's now in Riyadh in Saudi, and I look at that and I go, not anymore. It's kind of, that time is gone, and it's part of the lexicon of what's been, but I don't seek to repeat it. That said, if something came up tomorrow and they said, you have to up sticks and move, we'd talk about it, but that's not on top of the agenda anymore.
Been there, done that.
As I said, at 65, there's times when I was 20-something, my first job when I was 21-ish, after graduating from architecture, had some karmic aspect to it. The two guys that hired me had been both with big firms, and they're just setting up a new business. This is one of those sliding doors things, I suppose. I'd had the interview, I'd given them all my CV, and I got the job. And later on, one of the partners, who was a bit of a funny coot, he said to me, we nearly gave the job to another bloke, but we were packing up your stuff to give it back to you, and a drawing fell out of one of the books that you gave us. And he said, and clearly you'd done the drawing. It was fantastic. And that got you the job, not the CV. But as I say, there's a sliding door moment. Had that job 6-7 years. That then was a springboard to the UK and Middle East for a little while. And in that time, I got married as well. My first marriage, I was divorced in, 1999-ish. Things didn't go well there for various reasons. They went well for a while, didn't go well here and there. So that's pre-ham sandwich, and then post-ham sandwich. That's the way I see the world a bit. So there were good and bad in both sides of that equation, but ultimately that second half has led me to this where I am today. And what am I fearful of today is more about, well, I might have had back when I was 40 about success and all that sort of stuff. I still want to be comfortable, but I don't have that driven desire to be absolutely top of the tree, so to speak.
When did that realization hit you, Martin? Obviously not so much in Dubai, but when was it that I'm happy with where I am? I don't necessarily need to climb that ladder anymore.
Yeah, I'm about 80% happy where I am. I'm looking at life now from the perspective, well, I'm 65. What do 65-year-old blokes do? They retire, most of them. All my friends are retiring. And I ask them, what do you do? And one of them says, oh, nothing. Go to Shark Bay, I do a bit of fishing. Another one looks after his kids. I don't share that view of the world. I think there might be something else. And I keep interest in all sorts of things, whether it be politics or the business of architecture. So, and it's a bit like Steve Jobs. I'm told one of the apocryphal things about Jobs, when Apple was in trouble and they brought him back and they said, what are we going to do? He said, we're going to wait. And they said, what do you mean wait? Well, something will come up. And they said, like what? So I don't know. When we see it, we'll know. And what came up was the convergence of computers and telephones and the smartphone. And apparently somebody came to him with this concept. He said, look, I've got this thing. It's got no keyboard. And everybody said, get out of here. And Jobs said, no, this is it. And of course, as you know, the rest is history. So I'm a bit like that at the moment. I'm in the Jobs phase of, well, something will come up.
Mm.
And it won't be, living out of a backpack in Howard Johnson in Dubai. I don't know.
Who knows? The theme that you're talking about too, that I'm just hearing really clearly now, is that you talk about luck or karma. To draw that to you, whether it be the drawing falling out of your book on your leaving, there has to be a wide level of openness to possibility. How do you describe yourself around that openness to possibility?
Yeah, I'll look at everything. Rachel will say to me, why are you looking at that job? So I'm interested in it. I'm not going to apply for it, but I get feeds, on LinkedIn, and I get feeds from various recruiters. One job came up because of a letter in the newspaper recently. I picked up I don't even know how I knew about it. Oh, that's right. A reporter that I know said, oh, have you seen this letter in the newspaper? And I looked it up. And sure enough, it was by a former premier of WA, and he'd written something about the City of Perth inquiry. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And I said to this reporter, I said, oh, he's very pro me in that, in a way. He said, yeah, you want to meet him? And I did. Long story. We ended up talking. I said, oh, by the way, I got these people who need some help in this area. And we ended up doing this project. We've done a few projects together. It's generated quite a lot of money, all completely by accident, because the skill sets we applied were appropriate. So this is not something I'd normally do. It was a subdivision where they hit a problem with a piece of infrastructure which was holding them up, and had been holding them up for about 6-7 years. And because of where I'd been in department of planning, I knew who to talk to and what to do, and we got it sorted out. And it's paid off over a period of a few years, and that's what happens. If you're open to something comes in.
And yet, interestingly, going right back to when you had that very successful business in Perth before the Asian currency crisis, maybe things were a little more structured and pulled together for you than what they are actually now.
Well, there was a pathway, and it looked fairly narrow. As I said, the plan that you made got destroyed by reality. Any plan that you might have had that had a linear sort of outcome was destroyed by something that I don't think anyone really predicted. The example was we were doing work in Indonesia, where we were working in US dollars. They always work US dollars. It's 8,000 rupiah to the dollar, to the US dollar. Within 6 months, it was 16,000 to the dollar. So you halved the value of the rup. And the clients all came and said, oh, sorry, can we do this in rupiah instead of US dollars? And we said, well, no, we can't. We can't afford to do the project. So completely unforeseen. I'm sure there's a lot more than I that their trajectories were altered forever by that event. And that was the killer. I mean, as I say, if it can put the salt and the Brunei off his work, it's pretty fundamental. So you can never plan for anything. And that's the lesson I mentioned, the spreadsheets of the business. And projecting a profit or projecting anything. My grandmother's favourite saying that my dad used to repeat, it's a Scottish thing, is live every day like tomorrow's your last, but it may not be.
That's very Scottish.
So you've got to be a little bit realistic. But on the other hand, there's no point planning 20 years ahead if you don't have some flexibility and openness.
Sensing that's what been part of that fear has been counterbalanced by your openness. So there's that fear of what am I going to do at 65? Everyone's retiring, but then there's openness to I'm not sure what's around the corner. So is that what counteracts some of those fears for you, Martin?
Yeah, when I've got fearful, and I've had fearful times, I've had some pretty dreadful times. I mean, I've had times sitting in a hotel room in Malaysia thinking, I don't know what I do. Things had fallen apart here, and here I am on my own. I'm in a hotel room in the zones. I don't know. What am I going to do? I think the fear then drives you to a place where you take pragmatic action. And what that's taught me is that not all pragmatic actions work, but some do. So there's no point just being fearful. You have to use the fear, and it does drive you. It's a gut feel. Like I've had that flip in your gut when something might even be as simple as getting a bill you can't pay. I mean, that happened a couple of times in business where we had consultants working for us that sent us an account, we can't pay it. And you get this combo of fear and damaged pride where you have to go back to your colleagues and say, sorry, I can't pay it. So in those cases, we come up with a plan. And that's how I ended up with the $20,000 overdraft, for example. The plan was, well, I'm not going to stiff these people. I'm going to say to them, look, can you charge me what's fair, cut the profit out of it because this project's gone down the hill. And that's worked, but I've still had to borrow money to pay it off. There's been a pragmatic action arising out of what was initially a real fear flip. And as I say, that gut sickness where you're going, oh, God, what am I going to do now? You could go into a corner and cry about it, but it's not going to get you anywhere. And my business partners one ended up in China, or another one ended up working for another person. So it had different effects. The effect it had on me was to dislodge me from a rigid view of things. You know, in a way, it was lucky there were no jobs here in Perth at the time either. Perth was pretty depressed because there was a lot of reliance on Asia. So there was nothing going on in Perth. There was nothing going on up in Asia. And so the fear drives you to say, well, let's look wider. I called people I wouldn't have thought of calling because I was fearful of not having something meaningful to do, but also to pay to keep me going.
Thanks, Martin. It's been really interesting looking at the ham sandwich moment.
Yeah.
And the trajectory of where that's led you, or philosophies along the way, and what's motivated you and where you are now. Knowing what you know now after the ham sandwich moment, what messages would you give your 10-year-old self?
I'd refrain in a way because whatever I say is going to be impacted by what happens tomorrow. You know, in cricket, they say the only ball that can get you out is the next one. Probably paraphrase again and say, just remember nothing is written. Now, that's not to destabilise someone, but to say, well, yes, things are as you see them, but it can change. And that's positive and negative. So be both aware, but also optimistic.
Yeah, the world is out there, so to speak.
Yeah. Be open. I could give you a plan for going from here to the Back to the Future. The guy gets given the book with all the sports results. Well, I haven't got that.
And so, again, you've already touched on this already, but what is the greatest gift that this has given you, the ham sandwich experience?
It cut me loose from what I perceived were essentials, and they weren't, because the only thing that's really essential is air and some water. And to use, again, another movie paraphrase from Castaway, he realised all he had to do was keep breathing. And so as long as you keep breathing, something will come up. It's a combination. Obviously, you can be ridiculous about it and just sit in a corner somewhere and wait for something, but that's probably not going to work. And you can be the opposite end of completely ridiculous and try everything. So somewhere in the middle is the balance. But again, as I say, it's what it's taught me is that not only do you not need these things, they are actually counterproductive in certain circumstances. Not only do you not need them, you should eschew them. BMW, for example, at the time was my thing because it was a status symbol. Yes, it was a good piece of kit, but was it the most efficient? Should have probably had a Camry as a company car, you know. It taught me that it's much more important that you keep breathing, you keep being open, that you Don't lock yourself into what other people see as the symbols of success and importance. You do what's right for yourself.
Wow. And I guess they are your top tips. Are there any other top tips that you would have for people?
The top tips are: no plan survives exposure to reality. No plan. If it does, well done, but there'll be the next step of it. It's like budgeting. Budgets, people say, oh, we're off the budget. Yeah, well, the budget's an estimate. And, oh, but the budget's locked in for a year. Well, we have to rebudget because things have changed. So the top tips are nothing's written. Keep breathing. Every situation, if you're facing a life and death situation in an aeroplane, parachute hasn't opened, you've got a reserve, well, you clearly know what you've got to do next. Pretty darn obvious. So every situation, if you've done your prep and if you have the background, you've probably got that reserve ship. But you have to have it prepared to some extent. But the top tip is don't relax too much, but on the other hand, don't get too carried away with being planned and rigid about what's coming next.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. Some wise words, and I love seeing how you've come to those top tips and those realizations from that ham sandwich moments. Thank you very much for joining Anne and I.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, that's our episode for today of What's Fear Got to Do with It. Thanks so much for your company. We hope you found it insightful and it left you with some helpful tips from our guests and some great points for you to reflect on. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Substack or follow us on your favourite platform. Leave a review. We'd love to know your thoughts. Maybe you'd like to be a guest or you know someone who you would like to hear their story. Reach out to us on Insta at whatsfear_podcast or email us at info@whatsfear.com. All the guests' show notes are below to find their tips. And until next time, from Jo and I, take care, stay curious, and keep the conversation going.